All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So we are here to talk about migrations. Migrations, as far as our experience goes, are some of the most consequential and impactful decisions an automation leader tends to make. Part of the reason that is because it's usually a trade-off for short-term pain for long-term benefits, and that means that there's got to be a lot of conviction that holds up to uh, proceeding with a migration, because there will absolutely inevitably be short-term pain. Before we go further into the topic, I do want to just go over some housekeeping items. So on the Zoom functionality, and this is something that Ryan and I are a little less familiar with, but on Zoom functionality, we actually can't see you. So even if you do have video on, or attempt to unmute your mic, by default, this webinar functionality does not let us see you. So if you are making facial expressions, raising your hand physically, we won't be able to see you. However, you can use the functionality on Zoom to either chat, raise hands, or have a Q&A functionality. We do have other members of the Ashling team with us that will also help answer questions. And then as Ryan and I alternate speaking, we'll also try to get to some of those questions. And then as we'll go through the agenda, we'll also have a Q&A section at the end, but please utilize this functionality. That's how you're going to get our attention. With that, going a little out of order here, we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves in kind of a joint fashion. So my name is Kevin Hong with Ashling Partners. Along with me, I have Ryan Neal. Ryan is based out of Toronto, Ontario. I am based out of Atlanta, Georgia. And I have the pleasure of introducing both of us today. And this is a bit of a scary thing because Ryan doesn't actually know what I'm about to say. But Ryan and I have actually worked together for the past 7 years here at Ashling, on and off on different projects, both together and separately, and various levels of implementation, including migration. And we actually both started out as hands-on developers, and have now transitioned since then to advising clients on their intelligent automation program operating models, as well as strategic direction. We've also had the pleasure of being a part of some very, very successful migrations, and some not successful ones. And today we are here to share with you a high level but candid overview from what we've seen in the field, in the wild, in real life experiences, and what we think organizations need to consider as they prepare for a migration journey. So with that, the agenda for today is as follows. We're going to first cover why an organization or an intelligent automation program considers migrating, why migrations fail from our past experiences, how to de-risk or mitigate those risks for failure, what to use and how to use current 2026 capabilities to accelerate migration, and then we'll have time at the end to save for any questions and answers that you guys have as an audience member. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Ryan to discuss exactly what type of migrations we're even going to talk about today.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. And yep, as Kevin mentioned, we do want to take just a quick minute to give a bit of a definition here because migration has a number of different meanings. As many are familiar here on this call, Ashling is a boutique intelligent automation firm. We specialize in AI and automation. So when we think about migration here, it's more so the transition of intelligent automation assets within or across environments. And that may sound very general, and by design, it is intended to be. This is not just about swapping platforms. It may be inclusive of moving from on-premise to cloud, major version updates across your intelligent automation platform, or just some refactoring activities. In short, those core governance qualities and concepts are going to apply, some more so than others. But ultimately, we're trying to keep this session as solution agnostic, mainly focusing on the principles, some of the lessons learned, and the platforms and the solution-specific aspects secondary. So in this case, this is the frame of reference that we're ultimately going to be looking at from a migration perspective. So the first question that may come to mind is, why would we even consider migration in the first place? And what we want to do is talk about the business case generally, or just some of the main considerations as to why an organization might think about this from a starting point. So we've consolidated some of the most common ones that we might see across many of the organizations that we've worked with. whether that be financial. Think of that as legacy platforms or older licensing models were built, maybe for a previous organization or a previous era. They don't necessarily scale the same way that more modern platforms or consumption patterns may be required for. So there is some maintenance cost there of maintaining, an older platform generally that impacts your budget. From an internal perspective, we're not naive enough to think that, regulatory requirements or internal requirements don't evolve. They absolutely do. And in many cases, we need a platform to keep up with that as well. So whether that is, again, platform to platform, changing the way that developers interact with your platform, some of the different frameworks or the delivery lifecycle that you might operate in or compliance standards, ultimately, that might be a consideration as to why you're looking at a new platform or upgrading your platform generally. Two other main ones that you might think about are necessity. I know Kevin and I have come across this a fair share of times where the current platform is forcing some form of upgrade. So whether that is a version change or ultimately they are sunsetting a specific component, there may be a consideration of, well, we need to upgrade anyways. Why don't we consider this and take a step back from a more broad perspective? And the final one is maybe around modernization. Our AI era that we're in right now, as we sort of read this out in 2026, requires certain integrations, support, and agentic workflows that didn't necessarily exist when many of these platforms were first brought forward. So in this case, we think of technical debt as one that compounds. We need to consider that every automation that's built on a previous platform or in a version of a previous platform ultimately might make your eventual migration more complex or more expensive. So in this case, organizations that are looking to modernize now have the opportunity to build on a platform that's thinking about the next 5 years and ultimately bringing value in the future, as opposed to those that are maybe narrowing your options, where if you're just keeping the lights on of your current platform or the current platform version. So a couple of things to call out here is that this list is absolutely not exhaustive, and that they are not necessarily independent of each other. There is going to be some overlap. But what we like to call out is that when we're thinking about building the business case, the strongest business cases are the ones that combine multiple of these. Stacking some of these key drivers is ultimately going to increase our buy-in from our executive leadership team, which is one of the main important things that we need to think about when we're considering migration in the first place. So at a very high level, that's maybe some of the reasons why you might see organizations consider it. What we'll do now is I'll transfer over to Kevin to give a bit of an overview of maybe why we've seen migrations fail at a high level.
Thanks, Ryan. So I don't think I really thought this through when I put this together in this stage, but the first quote that I'm going to share on this slide is actually going to be from Yoda. So the greatest teacher failure is. I'm not going to imitate the voice, but I actually rewatched one of the movies the other day and thought, that's actually a good segue into what we're going to talk about. But as we're getting ready to share, and as I shared earlier, Ryan and I have seen our fair share of failures, both the ones that we've been a part of and the ones that we haven't been, and clients have told us about, after the fact. But they've taught us a lot of things, and categorically, these are some of the common pitfalls to why we've seen migrations fail. Now, before we go any further, I want to discuss and define what failure even means. I think we do want to kind of separate things like inherent or intermediate delays in a project timeline. That's not something that we're considering here in this conversation as a categorical failure. It's more of missing the primary objective or not meeting the primary objective for why it is that you chose to migrate in the first place. So some of the reasons that we've seen migrations fail is just a general underestimation of technical complexity. As Ryan mentioned, a lot of the platform migration, whether it's version to version, another, one vendor to another's platform, and so on and so forth, the uniqueness in our intelligent automation program platforms is that the assets and the solutions that are built in the platform need to be moved. So underestimating the technical complexity of those assets, I think is just a high level reason that we've seen these things fail. strategic disconnect, which is really just a disconnect or drift from the strategic objective. As I mentioned earlier, it's a matter of just losing the plot, I think another way to put it, is we forgot why we were doing this in the first place. We got too into the weeds, and somewhere, somehow, we just got lost in the shuffle. We do want to talk about that a little bit further on this next slide here, but for now, that's what strategic disconnect refers to. Next one is business disengagement. Again, while this is largely thought of as a technical platform migration and an effort, we truly believe that, again, the nature of our intelligent automation programs are inherently, baked into business involvement and partnership. So the business units that are transitioning from one platform to another, while they may not be into the code, they may not have to do all the same things as initial delivery. They do need to be a part of whether it's testing, validating, and or change management. Without that, we've seen a lot of that fail. So again, we do not see migrations as purely a technical effort. The other points are going to be legacy technical debt. So it's just whatever wasn't good in the old platform, old version, you're just moving right over. Though again, there's some contradiction here because we do want to manage scope and we want to focus on the primary objective. So again, it's a matter of transferring either technical debt or sometimes it's overcommitting to trying to fill those technical debt while you are transitioning from one platform to another. And the last one is just governance and skill gaps. It's just a lack of anticipation or planning for the differences in skill sets needed for the new platform or new version. And we're even talking about things like, again, not just code build or what is it going to take from one developer building in the current platform to another. It's things like, do we have at a program level a revised understanding of what the new technical capabilities are going to be at the discovery stage when we now identify new opportunities that meet with the new technical capabilities that we're bringing in, or things like production support, which again, I think we largely focus on the delivery, but is the new staff or is the new platform going to transition nicely into being able to be supported by either your current team or will you have a new production support team in place? So with that, double clicking into one of those, it's really the strategic disconnect. So the practical example is going to be just, let's say, as Ryan mentioned earlier, one of the reasons being necessity. Let's say that you ultimately decided that the reason that you needed to exit or migrate off of a version or a current platform is because you were approaching end of life and there was a time-bound component to this that you needed to get away from. I think when that strategic vision isn't in line throughout the migration effort, which has a tendency to have a long tail to this, what has happened in the past is, while we're in the weeds, a business unit says, hey, this is great. We understand that you need to do this, but while you're at it, can you do this one little thing here? Can you add this one feature? Can you account for one change in business logic? And the development team that's actually taking that on may think, okay, that's maybe 4 hours of effort. That's 6 hours here. That's another day, another week. And whether you're communicating with the project program or not, they may think that's fine. And then the unanticipated happens, you run into issues. And now we're missing not only the platform migration primary objective as a program, but now the solution doesn't actually deliver the core requirements that asset needed to be able to deliver in order for us to get off of the old platform. So again, when you do have the strategic objectives and the primary goals of a migration outlined, you do want to be communicative of those things to the rest of the program and also sticking to them, making sure that those are, thought of throughout the life cycle and we don't get lost in the shuffle and forget about those. From there, I'll go ahead and pass over to Ryan to talk about other ways that we de-risk migration risks and mitigate them. Ryan, did you have anything to add before we transition?
I think this is just, again, a practical example of one of the reasons in which we try to account for some of the risk that we see for migrations, or maybe some of the reasons in which they fail. What we'll talk about in just a moment here, and maybe it's just a segue in, is some of the other areas in sort of being proactive to plan and set the direction is really important for a migration. So I think maybe I'll reserve my comments to once I have this inspiring quote, and then I'll talk a bit more about an added item here. So I saw Kevin had Yoda as his inspiration, as I'll take note of. I wanted to have someone equally as inspiring as my quotes, and in this case, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Commonly attributed to Mike Tyson. Kevin does say it to me sometimes here. But the goal is moving towards the how after we've established the why and what goes wrong. So what Kevin was mentioning mainly is a practical example of some of the things that might be like an afterthought. And what we want to do in this section now is to shift our considerations towards, here are the items that we should be thinking about and tackling up front, because ultimately a migration strategy without a plan or without well thought out decisions is ultimately just words on a page or a slide deck. And really, from our vantage point, many migrations don't stall because of bad intent. It's because execution wasn't fully thought through, or we lose sight of the why and like the North Star. So ultimately tying it back to the why of why are we doing this in the first place. So in this case, as we jump forward, de-risking is not about eliminating uncertainty. What we're trying to do is ultimately design for it. So from our perspective, we've put together three main steps that will sort of tie back to some of the failures and the why that we talked about earlier. But ultimately, it's a three pronged approach where these aren't sequential necessarily. They're interdependent in that they should inform one another. So these three stages that we'll talk about in just a moment, don't think of them as mutually exclusive. They do feed in and a way to help design going forward. So the first step that we call out is around identification, and it's defining the as-is limitations or mapping what we want out of the future state. And a good way to frame this is tying back to the why. What are we trying to accomplish as part of the migration in the first place? So it's sort of taking inventory and stock of what we have today and identifying, what legacy limitations do we have today? Are there complexities that are going to compound that we may not have thought about that ultimately we're trying to address as part of this migration? So whether that again is moving to a cloud version of a platform, that might be one of the reasons that we consider sort of identification and identifying what are the challenges that we're feeling today. That ties nicely into around the capability mapping and ultimately trying to understand, okay, well, if we understand what we are working with today, what does the new platform bring that ultimately we're lacking that is going to solve some of those pain points? We commonly say in some scenarios that we don't want to have a technology or just a solution running around looking for the problem. What we want to do is take stock of the way that the organization operates today, with the way that our IT team and our automation department operates. What is the problem we are trying to solve? And ultimately, what capability or what function feature of the new platform is going to help us drive and resolve that challenge? Because that's ultimately, the main reason of why, the North Star of what we're trying to accomplish. A couple other items that we frequently call out as part of the identification phase is the modernization triage. And in this case, it's more so thinking about, does everything need to be upgraded? Does everything need to be migrated? Or can we be more strategic about that and think about, is there architectural design, or is there an area in which we might really consider migration and there might be a separate approach there? We recognize that it's not an all or nothing. In many cases, there's a lot of gray areas between, but ultimately it's a consideration that we want to make up front. And the final one is around operational readiness. So assessing our current capabilities. Kevin called it out as one of the items in which we see migrations fail. What this is taking stock of is, what is our current capability from a governance standpoint? What does our COE look like? What is our team structure and ultimately our team skills? Because that's going to feed very nicely into, okay, when we're creating a plan, what does the enablement look like in order to manage our team and successfully set us up for success ongoing? So in this case, identify easily is thought of as what are we doing today and where are the gaps that we're looking to fill? The second step is justification. And justification is at its core, building the business case for why you are going to make that decision and ultimately trying to win over your executive leadership team to help them understand what is the point of a migration, right? In this case, we don't want to do it just for the sake of doing it. It's now taking the why and applying some of the rigor and the analysis behind it to then hold up some of the conversation and the questions that we're going to get from our executive leadership team or from a technology evaluation board. Those are going to be items that we want to think about early on because it's ultimately the questions that are going to hold up and what we need to point back to in the future. So in this case, total cost of ownership or balancing the current licensing cost against what we're going to see in the future is something that, of course, is going to be a question. I know from my executive team and many that we've spoke to at our clients, the first question is going to come around financial impact. So what is our current cost? What do you project out to be the future state cost? And what value are we going to receive? Those are very common questions and ultimately ones that we want to have a form of a answer to so that we can then hold some sort of justification as to why this is important and why it's going to be beneficial from the organization. So the current cost and the innovation dividend, as we call it, is quantifying what is the financial impact or what unlock are we going to have when we bring in additional capabilities. So another example of that may be platform to platform or something like moving from on-premise to cloud. What is cloud going to unlock for us that ultimately is going to be extremely valuable and pay for its own, pay for the struggle and the risk that we're taking on as part of that migration. The final two are more so around the timeline. Of course, that would be the next question from our executive team is, great, you've proven that that the cost might be worth it. The value that additionally is going to be brought in makes sense. How long is this going to take? Because that's ultimately the next question is how much time can we allocate and what is the plan at a high level in terms of mapping out what the migration steps are and what the business value is going to be and when can we expect it. The migration risk pricing is one that is very specific to potentially a platform to platform or ones where we can't necessarily just have a cut over and immediately move to a new platform. The assumption there is that there's probably going to be some overlap around parallel system testing and ensuring that we're de-risking it from the standpoint of the old legacy platform is still running and the future state is up and running and being tested. There is going to be some overlap and ultimately some cost there. So it's something that we always call out and one that we want to make sure that we take into consideration because ultimately there is going to be a bit of overlap, or in many cases we suggest that there is a bit of overlap and not just a cut over immediately. The final step around mitigating risk is really when we move away from the sort of the structuring and justification of why we're going to make the change. And we can think about this as to, okay, well, we've gotten the green light. How do we then move into a execution type focus? And the goal here is that as soon as we get the green light, what are things that we can be doing to ensure that our delivery engine is going to move as fast as possible, ultimately de-risking us there where we don't want to flip over to a new platform or think about a new platform and immediately be caught flat-footed. We want to ensure that we set up some of the right precautions and the right tasks so that those happen up front and then we can continue forward. So a couple items there are around planning your roadmap. So in the case of an update to a platform to platform, you might think about grouping automations into a logical sequence or ones that are going to reduce risk or potentially reduce your licensing cost on the legacy platform. We don't want to just sort of look at it from we'll start with this department. Ultimately, there may be reasons as to why you might sequence your roadmap from one vantage point or another. It could, again, be based on if we are needing to move off and if there's compliance risks, that might feed into our sequenced roadmap. From a functional testing perspective, we do want to make sure that we design a airtight testing strategy. But one of the things that we always call out, and I think I've seen it many times over, is that when we think about migration, we say, well, that automation or that project is already in production. We don't necessarily need to think about like access to the code, the environments, or test data. And I think in some cases, it's a bit of a rude awakening where it's, well, that might actually feed into your sequence roadmap to understand, do you still have test data that's available? Do you still have the developers that maybe, helped build the original automation? And do we have access to the application full stop? Because ultimately, from a migration standpoint, we consider that table stakes. But as we know from like net new deliveries, that's always a big challenge. And in some cases, it may not be readily available at our fingertips. From a planning perspective too, with a new platform, or as we look at new features for a platform, establishing the guardrails and templates and understanding, what new capabilities are we bringing in to our organization? It's going to be important to think about the governance layer there around how do we ensure that folks are abiding by the quality standards that we typically would have had from a previous platform, or how do we ensure that we have the guardrails set up from an AI and an agentic standpoint to ensure that we're still meeting our regulatory and compliance requirements. And the final item just around planning is enablement and upskilling. And I know Kevin mentioned it earlier around why we see some of those migrations hit some walls. And we talk about it from an identification standpoint of taking stock of the current team's capabilities. We also need to start thinking about training plans for those team members as they work on a different platform in the scenario of if it is platform to platform. Launching some of those training plans, ensuring that they can upskill beyond just the traditional developer path or production support path that potentially they may have had previously. So in this case, it's more thinking about what does the enablement look like? What is the timeline for enablement? Putting a bit of a time box around it so that we're not just migrating without a plan. There's a bit of a sustainment approach there as well. So those are the 3 steps that we generally see just based on some of our experience. And there's certainly a lot more that goes into each one of those. But just from a high level, those are maybe some areas in which we always encourage our clients to think about, because ultimately, if we're not thinking about them, those are going to come up along the way. And if we don't put any sort of thought capital into them early, it sometimes does create a bit of a hurdle down the road. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kevin to talk about accelerating migrations and how we might think about that.
Thanks, Ryan. So as of June 11th, 2026, because we're living in a very fast-paced environment, I did want to talk about the topic that everybody is talking about, asking about. We're getting way too many questions about it, which is how do we use AI? What can AI do? And can't AI do everything already? So to be very specific about what we believe can and can't be done to accelerate migration, and some of these are actually going to apply to general delivery life cycles these days. And again, subject to change by next week at the current pace of technology advancements. We have 4 examples of what it is that we think AI does now to assist and accelerate migration. And again, the key word being assisting. So we don't believe right now that current AI capabilities are a full replacement of, call it human intelligence and effort, but they are great force multipliers or accelerators. So we're going to keep using that terminology throughout. With that, again, at the core of when it is that after your roadmap has been determined, after you are greenlit for the migration itself, somebody somewhere is going to need to review current artifacts and current code. So there are current AI capabilities that are capable of explaining code. I know Ryan mentioned the example of are the developers who build the original code around. Ideally, you're not relying on their memory from however many months ago that they built the solution. And at some point, you do need to review and analyze the existing automation code to generate things like documentation, technical specs, or even architectural diagrams and whatever you want to use it for. The current AI capabilities have been shown to be really, really good at explaining those types of things, especially if you are transitioning from one platform to another where they have different syntax, different coding languages. Using that to explain what the current code is doing has shown a lot of fruits in using AI. The next one is, again, similar in that style, analyzing current SOPs or processes. So if you do have other artifacts that are not code or as a supplement to your code to help explain any gaps in the automations that are running today, you can run your SOPs or process diagrams or any other artifacts to generate some additional documentation for your future platform or version. The third one is going to be building code. It's the one that everybody's very excited about. For those of you who have actually tried this, whether it's in high code or low code platforms, such as intelligent automation platforms, I think it's really good so far and shown a lot of promise at drafting initial automations, not necessarily final ones, but it is a great accelerator to build out your initial set of code frameworks. And again, if you leverage the previous components such as reviewing existing code and analyzing SOPs, we've seen AI models be able to get you to a really, really good starting point. Ultimately, still need to be filled out by developers to review, customize, update, and even test. So the last thing, so while automation testing in itself is a hot topic, the other thing that we've seen AI models be able to do really, really well is take all of these previous artifacts that we've talked through and be able to plan out and list out your test scenarios that need to be tested. So in an exhaustive manner, if you said, these are my procedures and this is the automation that needs to, be able to complete these steps, AI models have shown great, promise in being able to generate, again, still initial sets of test scenarios. Now, where that translates into is ideally, again, if you do have some more modern target applications, you're able to turn those test scenarios into test data to be able to mock up that your target applications will accept, and then, of course, run the new automations against those testing scenarios and the mock data that corresponds to it. But that is, of course, dependent on the target application's ability to accept them, take them in, and coordination with those application owners to be able to run those. So those are 4 examples of where we've seen current, again, 2026 June capabilities, where we've seen a lot of promise, a lot of good return on using AI models. And I'll actually turn it over to Ryan to share some of the not so good use cases and some of the things that AI models can't do.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And so it's a bit of an interesting and catch-22 here because we are an AI and automation company. And of course, we are advocates of thinking about an automation first mindset. But one of the things that we always call out is that AI and agents can do a lot, but they don't replace or augment everything. In many cases, from what we have seen just around some of the migration challenges or even just projects that we think about generally, there are a lot of components that aren't necessarily, hands-on keyboard that drive us towards successful outcomes. And that doesn't necessarily change whether that is a migration or just general project cleanup. So in this case, a couple of the main areas that we think about from a project delivery lifecycle and some of the main considerations that still need to be there that don't necessarily lend very well to AI and agents yet. And again, I'll use the same disclaimer as Kevin in terms of today in 2026, but these are ones that we do predict there is still going to be an absolute reliance on them because there's just no way to replicate this currently. So from a business stakeholder engagement perspective, making sure that the business and stakeholders are involved in that decision and that it's not a unilateral decision is one that is going to be extremely important, right? In many cases, the business and generating value for our key stakeholders are going to be the key champions and the drivers of the program's success. So in this case, AI and agents can help us define some of those requirements. It might help us be able to build certain components, but ultimately we need our business stakeholders to be able to confirm um, what is the scope and have we gotten the business case correct and what is the desired outcome? Because that's ultimately going to define some of the parameters as to how we define success in the first place. So that will absolutely still be there, and it's one that we still need a level of human interaction for. User acceptance testing sort of follows the same vein there, and it's a bit of a counterintuitive one because I know Kevin was just mentioning where, okay, well, if we can use AI to help generate test cases, shouldn't this be something that is, shouldn't even be on the slide? And one of the arguments that we would say is ultimately it can help generate test cases. We can use AI for test scripts and ultimately understanding what is the performance of the automation. But it's just that where it's largely the performance of the code and did it operate correctly. And from a user acceptance testing perspective, we need to have the business validate that the solution is actually doing exactly what it's intended to do in terms of what is the desired outcome, not necessarily is the code working. And there is a big differentiation there. So in this case, we can't necessarily replace some of that judgment or even some of the validation of the successful outcomes because those might live in target applications or in some cases, they may not be cleanly documented by our business partners, but ultimately we need to make sure that as part of the user acceptance testing, we're building the confidence in the solution. The final two that we have on the slide are around project management and change management. They do overlap a little bit, but from the project management standpoint, one of the things that we consider is that especially as a consulting organization or when we think about some of the internal delivery teams that we work with, there's an ultimate level of accountability that still needs to be there. And we still need to have great people who are going to make the decisions and call out risks and sort of accept the trade-offs that require human judgment that are ultimately going to lead to some of those successful outcomes. Yes, there is a cognitive aspect to AI, but there's a lot of context that may not necessarily be there, or there's a lot of relationship aspects that go into many of the decisions that we make that ultimately help us drive towards a successful outcome. So it's one of those ones where, project management, be it in some cases a struggle, it's one that is absolutely still going to be necessary because we need to ensure that we are following the project plan and keeping all of our stakeholders involved as part of that. The last one to call out is just on change management. And mainly this is called out as like a people problem. And when you think about change management, we need people to inspire adoption. We need to build confidence. Humans are the ones that are deriving the strategy and ultimately the communication plans that are going to help our leadership and our team members sort of fall in line. And ultimately, we need to make sure that we're setting the right expectations for those capabilities and for the projects, because that's the way that we're going to be able to communicate the success of a migration or just generally within our process delivery lifecycle. We need to ensure that change management isn't just an afterthought. So all of that to say that it is still extremely early, and we predict that these are going to be areas in which are going to be very important and continue to play a role. But there is still an aspect where humans are still going to need to interact with our AI and agentic friends, and there is an opportunity to accelerate some of that execution, but it doesn't ultimately replace the organizational work that's going to make our migration stick and make many of our projects the successes that we really hope and know they can be. So with that, I think we'll now turn it over. I saw some questions coming in on the chat. We'll move into more of a Q&A based topic here. I think that there was one or two that were raised. What I'll call out is that, as Kevin mentioned earlier, we do have the open chat. We have the Q&A channel, as well as please raise your hand and you can even come off mute when our team allows you to ask questions. So happy to answer any questions that folks have raised so far. Okay, just seeing some questions come in here.
Hey, hello.
Yes.
Are you perfect? I actually got a thank you so much for the sharing. This is super insightful. I do got some lots of takeaways on that. Thanks, Ryan and Kelvin. My question is, how do you handle the skill gap when your team was trained on the legacy platform? What's your take on that?
Do you want me to start, Kevin, and maybe you can jump in afterwards?
Yep.
Okay. Um, so in typical fashion, I would say that the challenges are one where it may be dependent on the organization and what type of migration that we're talking about. So for the purpose of this answer, I'll frame it as, thinking about a platform to platform where it is a broader skill gap, where ultimately the assumption is you're going to be changing and there's going to be a lot more of a learning curve than if you were just going from, on-prem to cloud, may not be as much. So we'll talk about the biggest learning curve here. And the way that I would approach that is, in many cases, there is a fundamental knowledge base that team members might have from a legacy application, and there's a lot of concepts that are going to be very similar. I would say that I wouldn't take that lightly in the sense that there is an opportunity to try to translate and sort of bridge the gap between a new platform or new capabilities that are going to come. So the way that we would approach that generally is if we can translate that to, the language that they are familiar with is going to be really helpful in sort of meeting them where they are. But then when we think about actual, bridging the gap, there's a ton of training out there, and in the world that we live in today, forums as well as free training programs are available at all times. So I would say that it's one where we always encourage folks to get in and get involved as soon as possible and just start learning. But from our perspective, we do offer training programs that we support others, and we approach it even from a mentorship uh, standpoint, because one of the things that is readily available, or I guess very, very clear, is that the way that we learn with a lot of these tools is learning by doing, and it's not necessarily just the practical aspect. So in many cases, when we work with clients, one of the things that we suggest is, look, if you can get the fundamentals down just by training and sort of understanding what the new platform might look like, once you're ready for it, we can then ride side by side, have you shotgun to help you learn and have someone that's going to provide guidance and mentor you. So those are a few ways that we try to approach it from a, bridging the skill gap perspective. But Kevin, is there anything else that you think maybe I missed on that?
Yeah, I think I don't think you necessarily missed it, but again, I think this is where skills and training are almost meant to be, distinguished, and same with training and experience. So if you think about anything that you have worked on for, whether it's 3 to 5 years, or more, um, the level of knowledge and familiarity that you got to over those years didn't get there overnight, and it definitely didn't come from attending a lot of training. So while those training reference materials are always helpful, um, that's really the starting point. So to make this not particularly, call it self-serving for Ashling as a services organization that provides mentorship, the things that we would recommend are talk to peers, right? Whether it's even competitors that have gone through similar considerations and migrations, and say what were some of those pain points. I think if the goal is to keep as much of the current staff transitioning over to a new platform, new version, you still want to at least seek out some, whether it's temporary partnership or some outside skill sets to be brought in, house, so that you can accelerate the growth curve and the training curve for your internal team as it currently stands. So again, if you think about how painful it is to learn a new thing without somebody guiding you that's kind of done it along the way, that in itself is a very underestimated trait of these migrations. Again, it can be overcome with help, but if you think about this as a sense of, and this is where I might do a disservice to some of our platform partners, is if you think a 1 week, 2 week training is going to now match your skill level that you've accumulated in the last 3 years on a single platform, moving to a different platform. That's not how this is going to go. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you that, but so I think all in all, comparing, experiences, not underestimating that, thinking about, ways that you can leverage outside help, whether it's temporary or permanent, are going to be the things that help your current team move to, a new platform, new version, or whatever the transition, is that you're considering. Okay. I think we have another question. Madison, do we have a person on unmute? Yeah.
Hi, good morning. This is Apurva here. Thank you very much. Always enjoy the Ashling presentations. My question is in regards to migrating the legacy systems that cannot integrate with the new system, especially in the loans and banking space, where we have a lot of existing loans for renewals, but switching it to the new platform is very difficult. Can you share some light on the identify practice that you just mentioned?
Yeah, I guess in your example, are you talking about, whether it's automations that work with your legacy systems versus a new one, or are you talking about an actual platform migration from an old one to a new one that lacks functionality?
Right. The second one. So migrating from the old one to the brand new one. Yeah. Bringing the old stuff together.
Yeah. No, that's a tough one. I think, generally when we're considering, migrations, you're ideally not considering migrating to a platform with, call it, lesser capabilities, and for whatever your suitable needs are. Now, in your steps to identify and justify those things, those have to be baked into the consideration. And if that means that you are going to lose, whether it's functionality, capability, or even lines of business as a result of the platform migration, you may want to consider alternatives and or even diverging off to you know and as unideal as this sounds, a separate system, or being able to straddle across multiple systems that can handle your net functionality needs. So it's a really, really difficult transition to be able to make and say your current business model is able to handle these functionalities and your current platform is able to do so. And considering an approach or a migration to a new one that lacks that functionality, it's hard to see a scenario in which that when you're going to take that kind of a negative impact, that you would still move forward and consider that migration without some kind of an alternative that still meets your business needs. Without saying don't do it, I don't know if that answered your question, Apurva.
No, thank you very much, Kevin. Appreciate it.
Okay. We have one more. Braden.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Quick question. In regards to a platform-to-platform migration, whether it's, say, Automation Anywhere to UiPath, vice versa,
yep.
Project model or even methodology, think agile, maybe waterfall. Have you guys found the most success in? Maybe ones that you have utilized that you didn't have a lot of success in and tend to stray away from? Especially when you're considering kind of inventory of maybe, 50 to 75 automations in total that need rebuilt in that, opposing or opposite software. And kind of, just staging the question here a little bit more, right? Maybe think multiple developers, 6 to 8, maybe a couple delivery managers, so on and so forth. Just any insight you might have would be beneficial.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think something that we should have emphasized, at the beginning. But this is kind of, again, core of some of the considerations and some of the questions that we're getting asked from our clients, in this day. From a platform to platform migration, I think that's when you really shine a light and a magnifying glass to your current program governance structure. So there is no one size fits all for that. Unfortunately, it's not going to be a single answer to that. I think what we have found, or at least I'll speak for me, and then I'll ask Ryan to add here, is that the roadmap and the sequencing matters more than kind of the project structure. So what I mean by that is if you do have 50 automations, it's a matter of which and how you're selecting which one goes first, rather than how it is that you're going to work one by one by one. And I think there's kind of the two extremes is you don't want to you don't want to start with the simplest one, because I think that sets you up poorly for an expectation of your rest of the roadmap and saying that this is going to be relatively easy, this is fine. You don't want to do the hardest one up front, because not only will it be detrimental, but you're going to have to go through a lot of painful issues, mistakes that you're going to learn from your first one. So you almost kind of want to strategically map out what are you looking to gain, what are the diverse capabilities and functionalities that you're going to want to test out in this new platform first, and select those things strategically without it being, call it, overly complex or overly simple. And then from there, it's, I think, again, assuming that you're working with the teams that you have, you want to keep as, little change. That would be my opinion. Probably not, necessarily universally agreed, but, you want to keep as minimal change. You're already, taking on this massive change. So if you're on waterfall now and that has consistently worked for you, I think it's one less change that you want to consider, at least in the immediate, and not necessarily make a drastic change from waterfall to agile versus, vice versa, but rather make incremental adjustments along the way after you have those intermediate checkpoints to be able to say, okay, well, we because it's the first one, it's the first batch that's being transitioned over from one platform to another. Let's make sure that we have extra governance, extra eyes on this, so that we all as a program learn from the first batch, if that wasn't already baked into your project's project management structure, and then be able to make sure that those lessons that you learned from the first one incrementally, right? Not just at the end, not as a retrospective at the end after you've gone through all of the pain points of the first one, be able to transition that and say, okay, now from there, what adjustments are we going to make? And again, in my opinion, Braden, I think that's less about, call it, agile versus waterfall, versus, whatever the new hot term is nowadays. It's going to be, let's now think of it in a bigger holistic picture and select the first set of automations to be able to learn from as you're transitioning from one platform to another.
Okay.
Brian,
One thing,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Maybe what I'll throw in there as well, Brandon, is that Kevin approached that from the prioritization and determining what matters to start with, and effectively saying, let's prioritize the things that are going to bring success and effectively get some wins under our belts and show value. And it's sort of determining what makes sense to move with first, and sort of reducing some of that risk generally. What I'll do is maybe approach it from even a more granular level, because Brandon, the example you gave was like, okay, if we have 50 processes that we need to move over, one of the considerations that you might think about from a project management standpoint, and regardless of agile, regardless of waterfall, is that if you're moving from a legacy platform, the assumption is that they've already got something running in production today, the business does, and they already have a desired outcome that is going to be expected. So if you think of that as just throwing a number out there, a 90% success rate, they might not be willing to spend the time to support you to say, well, we're just going to roll out a small portion of this and only do a small components, and ultimately sort of ramp up and test that. With the business partnership and the relationship that we build, maybe they will, and sort of de-risk it from moving to a new platform. But ultimately, one of the things that we talk about with some of the clients is that there's an expectation that's built in where they're already used to a certain success rate and a certain outcome, and we need to be able to meet that with the new platform. And so in that case, that might also limit your decision as to can we actually approach this on an iterative way, or do we need to make sure that we're rolling out a solution that's going to account for exactly what they're looking for? Because if I'm a business line owner, or if I'm a process owner, and you told me that you were going to say, well, we'll automate 50% of it and we'll slowly ramp up and grow on it, I might not love that approach too. So there are some limitations there that we might have to think about in terms of a very granular approach on a process to process standpoint that ultimately we need to account for, because that's ultimately the business partners are the ones that we're trying to ensure that we bring value to. So I guess, Braden, does that answer your question or anything else there?
Yeah, no, that was insightful. I appreciate it, Ryan.
With that, we'll turn it over to our final slide here. So the material that we went over on this webinar will be shared to the attendees after. Just want to thank everybody for joining and spending 58 minutes with us. Hope there was some takeaways, and if you do want to talk to us more about, again, your experiences, share them so that we can also learn from each other on that. There will also be a meeting request link that will be sent as a part of the materials. But again, want to thank everybody for joining today. Hope it was a good use of your time today.